Alrighty. Thank you guys for having me. It's beautiful up here, so I'm glad to be up here this weekend. I'll be talking about a lot of different projects that I've worked on recently with different local government and utility entities, essentially revolving around the future of natural gas.
You might be able to which slide to go to.
Yeah, so we can go to the next slide. Oh, there we go.
Last name is Wentworth.
Yeah. On the second slide, I just wanted to talk about all of the different partners I've had. I'm going to be talking about like 4 different projects super briefly. So this work has come about from work with City of Oakland, San Francisco, University of California, San Diego's Deep Decarbonization Initiative, SoCal Gas, and Sempra Energy, and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. So lots of different projects. It's probably the third slide. This is kind of just like the fact sheet of natural gas. So when we talk about natural gas, we're talking about methane, of course, you guys know that. It's 86 times more potent of a warming agent, so how much it warms the planet, than carbon dioxide over 20 years. It only survives in the atmosphere 8 to 12 years. The lifetime is dependent on concentrations of the hydroxyl radical, which is basically like the detergent of the atmosphere. It gets rid of almost all of our pollutants. When methane, CH4, is oxidized by the hydroxyl radical, OH, there's a bunch of different reactions that happen, but essentially it's converted back into carbon dioxide and water, which is also a greenhouse gas, so we're not totally getting rid of it as a warming agent. It's just converted into other warming agents. Within all of those different reactions, it also has a short stint as formaldehyde. And then a couple of just different like facts: increasing our CH4 levels affects the ability of the OH radical to oxidize other pollutants. It increases water formation in the stratosphere, which can lead to additional surface warming and decreased stratospheric ozone, which is the ozone we like because it protects us from UV radiation. It can contribute to low-level ozone. We've seen some NOAA and NASA studies looking at super remote fracking sites during the winter time when there's not a lot of sunlight to create that ozone reaction, and they'll have ozone levels higher than like Riverside in the summer. It's pretty crazy. And then, wait, how do we see the bottom of this screen? Oh, I can scroll down, never mind. Also, just as a fun fact, any sort of pollutant that increases heat in the climate system, every degree warmer the climate gets, it's kind of the rule of thumb that the atmosphere can hold 7% more water. So of course that increases things like storms, and other things like that. So on slide 4, the first part of this talk is going to be talking about how we don't necessarily quantify leaks right, from 2 different perspectives. One would be we tend to, and this is a contested argument, but we can systematically underrepresent methane in our inventories, which is important, because inventories a lot of times drive policy and prioritization of sustainability programs. So by using a 100-year global warming potential, we can show methane to warm the planet less than maybe other sectors, since it is a shorter time frame pollutant. I'll go into that in a second. And then we are likely using outdated emission factors in inventories. That's why a lot of this work is being conducted now. Is our emission factors were created in like 1996 primarily, and a lot of different equipment even is being used now instead. So slide 5, next slide. This is just a chart. Ooh. I don't know what's happening. There we go. I'll just use this. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so this is not a scientifically accurate chart. I just kind of drew some lines so I can get a point across, just talking about global warming potentials. The blue line would be how methane reacts in our atmosphere. It instantaneously warms the atmosphere more than 86 times than carbon dioxide, and is oxidized on different time frames by OH until it's converted into CO2 and goes down to that one line. When we look at, we either have to average the warming potential over 20 years or 100 years per IPCC. We can do it different ways. The which one you choose depends on which timeline you care about. There's good arguments to say that we should be looking at a 20-year time frame at this point, because there are things like tipping points and you know, if we're trying to reach 2100 goals or 2050 goals, it influences, like I said, the prioritization of sustainability programs. So there's good reasons to look at the 20-year global warming potential, but there's also fair reasons to look at the 100-year as well if we're more worried about what the climate looks like in 100 years. All right, so the next slide, I'm going to just briefly talk about leak rates. Natural gas emits higher methane levels than we've accounted for in the past. That's all changing right now. The EPA says that we leak about 1.4%. Different atmospheric estimates range, have a pretty large range, but some say 3.2 to even 4.8% leak rate. EDF just came out with their kind of big bottom-up study, so going to many different natural gas facilities and pipelines trying to find their own estimate. They're going with 2.3%. It's definitely hard to track methane emissions from both of these perspectives. Bottom up, of course, it's really expensive to drive around to every facility and conduct a fair enough assessment over multiple days to really figure out a proper leak rate, and then atmospheric estimates. It can be hard to attribute the methane you see in the atmosphere to specific sources. There are ways to do it, ethane-methane ratios and isotopic tracers, but things can get lost in the mix. So we do see like a bit of a discrepancy, but there's an argument that it might not really matter what the nitty-gritty detail is, because if we're seeing leak rates between 2 and 3%, like Mark already said, that does have a really big impact. It can double the emissions from combustion of natural gas, just accounting for a leak rate that's potentially low. So the next slide, the leak rates do vary pretty drastically by production zone. So we can have, I mean, we tend to have lower leak rates over on the West Coast versus more of the like Pennsylvania area. But so this can be a local issue, which makes creating a national emission factor really tricky, and people can argue about it all day. So this next slide, leakage attributed to California, kind of that variety in production zone leakage led this study, which was done in conjunction with Sierra Club, is basically to see, like Mark said, California imports 90% of our gas. So if we're only looking at leakage within the state, we're going to miss a lot of the emissions that come from Californians' demand of this fossil fuel. So it took a lot of work to find how much gas makes it here via pipeline from all of these different basins. But we finally got it from the utilities. So we were able to portion out the supply of Californians' natural gas from each basin. The leak rate found primarily from atmospheric studies or satellite studies on each basin specifically. And then added that up with Mark and CEC's California-based study to try to get a life cycle leakage rate. And we came up with potentially 3.6% for gas brought over to California, with an error maybe 2.4 to 4.3%. So the next project I'm just going to quickly go over on the next slide is this big question that utilities are looking at right now. That's the question of, is there any way that we can create a renewable natural gas standard similar to the renewable portfolio standard for electricity that allows gas companies to reach 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas reduction goals just by inserting as much renewable natural gas as possible? And renewable natural gas would be like tenting these big dairy farms, trying to capture that methane, produce it similar to fossil natural gas so we can put it in the pipeline and use it that way. And it's a really interesting idea because capturing that methane would reduce a lot of emissions from other sectors, which is necessary. But on the next side, we can see supply for this sort of thing is very limited. Even with adding things like all of SB 350's energy efficiency reductions and anything that CEC and CPUC has determined additionally achievable energy efficiency beyond those standards, and then adding in as much renewable natural gas that we can utilize within California, or that's technically feasible to capture within California, we can only reduce, I mean, with energy efficiency, about 11% below demand. But yeah, without that energy efficiency, it's really only 4% of demand that we can supply by California greenhouse gas, renewable natural gas. We can do things like import all of the United States renewable natural gas. And in that case, with energy efficiency, we could get about 34% below demand, but that's not even allowed by law right now. We have S606, which limits the amount of biofuels that we can import. But, you know, as just like a academic study, even importing all of that won't really help us. So it is a really interesting idea, probably good for smaller scale projects. Like I know a lot of wastewater treatment plants will capture their own methane and use it to run their own facilities. So it might be better for things like that. Yeah.
I just want to make sure I got that. So you're saying that if we captured all the renewable methane, it would only account for 4% of demand?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And 34 if we captured the whole country?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
30% of California, not 34%.
Yeah, just California's. Yeah.
And is that what's currently available, or what's projected to be available?
That's currently available. So capturing renewable gas. So that would be wastewater treatment plants, landfills, dairies, capturing. So the next slide is people looking at things like, why don't we grow sustainable biomass and then go through a methanization process to use that as renewable natural gas. So that would be like kind of more scaling up. And there was an LBNL study that tried to do that. And if we used all of the biomass that would be technically feasible to grow in California, and tried to apply it to both the transportation and the building sector, we would still fall short of cutting transportation emissions by 32%. So we'd still have to electrify transportation and the building sector because there just isn't enough land availability for that sort of thing. Other concerns for stuff like that include increasing the price of food because of competition for land. If you're making more money for biofuels and less money for food, maybe we'll have some sort of food shortage. RNG, renewable natural gas, might be better used for fuels that are really difficult to electrify, like jet kerosene and diesel. You also get a better credit for that under the low carbon fuel standard versus cap and trade doesn't really help all that much for costs creating RNG production facilities. And then finally, it would decrease land availability for more long-term carbon sequestration instead of that short-term grow, sequester, and then burn. So the next question is,
Next slide.
Yeah, sorry, next slide. The next question, if RNG doesn't work, can we even do it with electrification? And short answer is here on the right side it's going to increase our electricity demand, of course. We all intuitively know that. Maybe not as much as we would think in a 2011 electricity versus 2050 frozen case if we were not to use any sort of energy efficiency standards, versus if we do use energy efficiency standards and then electrify transportation and building, water and space heating, some industrial, we would still reduce our demand from the 2050 no EE case. So yeah, there's a ton of GHG reduction potential from electrification. This chart on the left changes depending on what methodology you put first. So not all of that reduction necessarily comes from efficiency. But yeah, if we increase our efficiency in all sectors, use low GHG electricity, electrify our water and space heating and industrial, electrify our vehicles, use some low GHG biofuels, and then conserve, we can even make it to our 2050 goal, which is super low. So that's exciting. A big argument that a lot of, next slide. A big argument that a lot of utilities will make is that this may not, if we were to electrify everything, it's going to be really hard to actually create carbon neutral electricity, and the price is going to go way up. And this, you guys can kind of dig into this slide later if you'd like. But the point of this is basically to show we have plenty of options to dramatically increase our carbon neutrality and stay within a similar price range. Maybe even there's a couple options that have a lower delivered price per megawatt hour while increasing carbon neutrality. However, this would require all of the Western states to kind of come together under this agreement that we're going to use more renewable electricity. We can't do it as California as a state alone.
So all of those bars include UCC?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is the short answer because of Northwest Hydro?
I mean, there's a ton of different options. So yeah, that would be one option. Yeah, so next slide is citation. So if anyone has any questions.
You account for the methane leakage in the renewable natural gas waterfall chart?
Yeah. Wait, sorry. What
Your
water?
assessment of how renewable gas supply would do in using current gas supply, whether you looked at the methane leakage effects and how that would sort of mitigate the effect of this renewable gas.
Yeah. So question is methane leakage included in this waterfall chart on RNG supply, and does that mitigate it at all? The issue with this, which would be kind of like a long conversation, is that if you're taking renewable natural gas, you're really only reducing the methane from the upstream sources. So any leakage along any other part from production to distribution to even in-home, like behind the meter leaks, nothing changes there. So that isn't included in this. This is more of like, can we even make California demand? But yeah, we would have to undergo a lot of infrastructure upgrades.
The same slide, what does the CCS stand for? Carbon capture and sequestration.
Yeah.
Carbon capture.
And one last question, Tom?
Yeah, let's see. Should I still compost my veggies and all that stuff? And is that really a problem in a big scope? And then also, I think I've read recently that there's some feedstock being developed where cows' methane emissions would be much lower. And that's
I've heard about that with like algae or something.
yeah.
Okay, Cal?
Because it's a sort of small scale here, do you have a bigger one?
Quick question, just on the leakage rate of 3.6% on slide 8, is that something that's published inside that?
Not yet. No.
So you would write this up.
I have it written up. It's waiting for review and all that sort of stuff. So not at this point, but
It'd be great when it is, and we can use it.
yeah.
because those are
Super important.
very
Yeah.
different than the kind of the 2% rates that we're using.
Right.
And so you're hearing that Pierre is trying to make a policy at the State House and needs your study to, as foundational work.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm happy to get that through quicker, but I'll definitely let you know when it happens.
So we have a break. Please approach the people who've enjoyed asking the questions and keep on going, and we'll see you guys in 5.